89% of business leaders say AI is a top priority. The right choice is crucial, which is why teams at 1/3 of Fortune 500 companies use Grammarly. Grammarly is the right AI assistant for your team. With top-tier security credentials and 15 years of experience in responsible AI, Grammarly is how companies like yours increase productivity while keeping data protected and private. See why 70,000 teams trust Grammarly at grammarly.com/enterprise.
It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. Now, you can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Really excited about today's show. We have Sean Howe. You can find him at Twitter at Sean Howe, and that's Howe. Now, you could find him on his website is SeanHowe.com. The book we're talking about today is Agents of Chaos, Thomas King Forçade, High Times and the Paranoid End of the 70s. I read a chapter of this book in the Rolling Stone. It's an excellent book. This guy's an excellent writer. He captures the time. As you know, I have some connections to this story. But Sean Howe, are you there?
I'm here.
Hey, man, thank you so much. Before we get into your book, Agents of Chaos, Thomas King Forçade, tell us about yourself. Who is Sean Howe?
Yeah, sure. I'm a writer in my 40s. I wrote a book before this called Marvel Comics: The Untold Story. And when I finished that book, I thought that was kind of a big, wide-ranging history. Maybe I'll bite off a little less this time. And it turned out that this book took me about 4 times as long to write. Yeah. So I'm emerging from hibernation with this book.
And how's the book been received? Because from my perspective, you know, like growing up in that time in that neighborhood, I think, boy, we were such obscure people. Like, who would even want to read about us? Back then, we thought we were nobodies, you know? And now to have a guy write a book about this, like it's history, you know? Like, how's the book being received?
It's getting really nice reviews. People are telling me they love it. It's just come out. There was an excerpt in Rolling Stone. There was an excerpt in Reason magazine.
Oh, really?
So trying to reach all the different political polls that I can. And it's been really terrific talking to people who were there. I spoke to a lot of people for the book, but I'm now getting a few stories that I had never heard before, and it's great to hear people say like this really takes me back to what it was like.
Yeah, I heard about the book through TrueAnon, because I subscribe to their, they send me their, I guess I'm on their mailing list or something. And I heard about it that way. And it's really rare for me to find a guest on another show and say, hey, let me interview that guest. But I just love this topic. Now, people can meet Sean Howe in person if they go to the October 2nd at 7 p.m. in Los Angeles at the Stories Book and Cafe. And also to October 6th. He's going to be driving around, this guy, or flying, I guess. October 6th at 6:30 p.m. in Phoenix, Arizona, the Changing Hands Bookstore. Are you flying or driving?
I think I'm going to fly, although it would be a really nice drive. Just that way I can stay in Los Angeles a little bit longer and see some friends.
It is a nice drive. You clear your head out in those deserts, man. I love that drive. I spent a lot of time.
I have made the drive.
Like Tom Forçade, I spent a lot of time in Arizona myself. All right, let's start with this, man. So the book is mainly about Tom Forçade or all the hippies?
I would say it's mainly about Forçade, but I came across his story, or I came across the outlines of his story, and I was like, who is this guy that I've never heard of that seems to have had a hand in so many different subcultures, from the Underground Press to, major magazine of the 1970s, High Times, the punk rock movement. He was very active in fighting for journalists' rights. And yet, I'm interested in all of these things, but I had never heard his name. And the more I learned about him, the more intrigued I was, because he was such a man of mystery. So there would be these adventures that he would pop up in, and, he would be, alongside Hunter S. Thompson or Johnny Rotten, but there was also so much that was kind of under a veil about him. And as I kept finding out more about him, I realized, he might be a good way to talk about the 1970s in a larger spectrum. And there's kind of this story of the 1970s that kind of skips from, Altamont was the death of the 60s, and then we had Watergate, and we had gas lines, and then Reagan came along. And there's really not much to connect the 60s and the 80s. And so I wanted to sort of maybe fill in some of the gaps of that history.
Yeah, and what a time to live in New York, man, during that period of time. And Chelsea Hotel, and Lower East Side with CBGBs, all that stuff, man. But it's fascinating, too, because, Tom Forçade tragically took his life the day before Jonestown. Right.
So there were, people I spoke to who remember those two events, finding out about Tom's death and hearing about Jonestown on the radio. And it was, I think, a week before Harvey Milk was killed. So there was this convergence of really terrible news, and a lot of it was, you could say that all of these things were sort of ends of eras in a way. 1978 seemed to me like, the final end of the 60s in a way.
Yeah. So tell us, who was Tom Forçade? Tell us about this man.
So the guy that we know as Tom Forçade just kind of emerged on the radical scene at the end of the 60s, when there was a lot of factionalism going on. SDS was splitting into different camps. SNCC had split up into different camps. Underground newspapers were kind of fighting with each other over who was more of a sellout. And this is, of course, just after Chicago 1968. So, the left and the center left are really also at odds. And Forçade comes on the scene, and he immediately arouses suspicion from everyone. I open with a scene in Buffalo at a drug symposium, and Timothy Leary and Abby Hoffman and the MC5, Allen Ginsberg, all these people are in this hotel room, and Forçade, comes into the room, throws a gun on the bed, and announces that he's the head of the Underground Press Syndicate. And the way that I heard the story was everybody kind of turned to each other and said, "Uh-oh, this guy's an agent." And that's kind of the amount of suspicion that was normal that he would arouse. So even as he took over running the Underground Press Syndicate, was this organization that coordinated between all of the different underground newspapers around the country. And so he was kind of in a position to manage all of this stuff. And he was traveling around the country, meeting people at different underground newspapers. And he was kind of insinuating himself with the leadership of the anti-war movement, the countercultural movement. But a lot of people just did not trust the guy, kept him at an arm's length, but he still was kind of, accruing power and influence.
Let me ask you a quick question. You tell the story about him walking into the room, throwing the gun down, but it seems like everyone else in that room is dead. Every other name you mentioned, Larry, they're all gone now. Abby Hoffman, they're all dead. Who told you that story?
That story came from someone who is no longer alive. That was an interview that Ken Kelly, who was a White Panther,
right,
and then later a kind of a prominent journalist for Playboy and other places. Ken Kelly told that story, and he, was remembering. He was one of the people who was especially suspicious of Forçade, and a lot of this, this story had to be told through archival materials. I talked to, I think, more than 150 people, and yet so much of the information also came from, microfilmed underground newspapers, and also some interviews that people before me had done. There were about 3 people who had tried to do a book about Forçade over the years, and none of those were ever finished. Some were barely started. So it was a lot of, hearing the voices of people who are no longer around. And, thankfully there were records of these conversations.
Now, who were your sources? Did you talk to people like A.J. Weberman?
Yeah, I talked to a lot of the Zippies, who, your listeners may or may not know were sort of an offshoot of the original Yippies. They were kind of formed in opposition to what they believed was the selling out of Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. Mm-hmm. They thought that the Yippies had gone too mainstream, gotten too cozy with the establishment. And so these Zippies, like A.J. Weberman, Dana Beal, Aaron Kay, they were sort of, more outrageous than the Yippies had been. And I spend quite a bit of time talking in the book about the confrontations between those two groups at the presidential conventions of 1972. The Democrats and the Republicans both held their conventions in Miami. So there was a whole summer of fighting between the groups. So I talked to a lot of Zippies. I talked to a lot of people at High Times. I talked to people in the underground press world. I talked to some people who had smuggled drugs with Forçade, and even talked to a couple police undercover agents. So much like Tom Forçade really compartmentalized his life, and so I had about a dozen different groups of people that I had to talk to individually, because each of them only knew part of the story.
Richard Stratton?
I spoke to him a little bit early on. Yeah.
Okay.
He was involved in some smuggling as well, and then later, of course, became involved in High Times.
Oh my goodness! Smuggling. Okay. Now, what about Steve Hager? What about it? Did he contribute? Because he seems to feel he's the keeper of the Tom Forçade story. Did he cooperate?
I've spoken to Steve Hager, but I really was concentrating on people who knew Forçade or were kind of around at the time. Forçade died in 1978, so there are a lot of people who are maybe 1 degree removed from Forçade, right, and who also have really contributed to kind of the legend of Tom Forçade, keeping that alive. But I wanted to get as many direct experience stories as I could. John Holmstrom is another person who he had done a great deal of research in writing articles on Forçade. John Holmstrom, the co-founder of Punk magazine, and later a High Times editor, and he had some tremendous stories about traveling on the Sex Pistols American tour with Forçade. Although traveling separate transportation, because Forçade, needed to keep his distance, his mystery.
Now, you mentioned off the air, we were talking briefly about Dana Beal, who was the head of the Yippies when I was around there. You mentioned that Dana Beal showed up at one of your book signings and kind of not unlike Dana Beal, commandeered the microphone and took over.
Right.
Yeah. How did he receive your book?
I don't think that he has read it. Right. I offered to give him a copy of the book after the reading, and he said he was interested, and he said another time. So he actually sent me his address. So I will be sending him a copy of the book. He certainly plays a big enough role in the book, and he was helpful in connecting some stories for me. I was thrilled before we started recording that you were saying that you were kind of exposed to a lot of those same characters.
Oh yeah. Well, which brings me to the question, because you mentioned this incident where he showed up with Abby Hoffman and Timothy Leary there, and he throws his gun down, and people right away assumed he was an agent. Now, that there's how much of that is covered? Not just him being an agent, but that all the paranoia that went on with this crew. You can't blame them. All the marijuana, the smoke, it makes you paranoid, and all the surveillance and infiltration that did really go on. How much of the infiltration, the COINTELPRO, the agents, do you cover in your book?
Yeah, it's kind of a always present thing. It's not just COINTELPRO and the CIA program Chaos. It's also at the time there were constantly stories coming out that say the U.S. Army was surveilling citizens. There was the Church Commission. So there were, as the 70s progressed, not only were people getting paranoid because of maybe their illegal activities or maybe whatever they were smoking, but also they were consistently being reminded that that there were in fact government agents who were trying to go after them. And so I think that's a huge part of the book is really what that especially during the Nixon years, what that kind of government surveillance and repression did to the psyches of all of these people. I think it's been said before, but really, COINTELPRO was maybe not even most effective as a way to, throw people in jail or get them in front of grand juries. It really just made everyone so freaked out that they suspected everyone else of being an agent or compromised in some way. So I wanted to talk about, that that environment that was so pervasive throughout those years.
Yeah. So so people who were making the allegation that Forçade might have been an agent, because when you look back, and you see Forçade driving around in stolen cars all the time, carrying weapons and tons of marijuana stashed all over Manhattan, and everybody getting away with all this. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, it's very easy to sort of present this story of a guy who's clearly working for the government. I mean, he comes on the scene with this assumed name. His real name was Gary Goodson.
Right.
He was from Phoenix, Arizona. But he comes on the scene. No one's ever heard of this guy. He has no background in the movement, as they call it. And he's suddenly brushing shoulders with the most influential people of the time, whether it's like John Sinclair of the White Panthers or Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. So he's got this access to all these people. Then he starts microfilming with Bell and Howell all the different underground newspapers. There are several government agencies which then have subscriptions to the underground newspapers, and they've got their hands on all that. So the people who worked with Forçade at the Underground Press Syndicate even said, well, I couldn't understand, if he wasn't, an agent, why would he be doing this? Even as they were working for him. So, then as his drug business kind of increases, then a lot of people question, well, why didn't he get arrested?
Yeah.
And in fact, I could not get any DEA or BNDD, the predecessor agency. I could not get any files through FOIA on Tom Forçade. There were also allegations that he had plotted to assassinate Nixon in 1972, and so this is talked about in his FBI files, and the Secret Service is, part of this conversation. But I could not get any Secret Service files either. On top of that, there are always the people who say, well, High Times, that's a perfect way to get mailing lists of all the people buying drugs or drug paraphernalia. How suspicious, could it be? So these are some of the reasons. And I guess there's also a very key thing. He also picked fights with all the other people on the left. That said, I did not find anything to prove that he was an agent. I'm not sure I believe he was. I think one really plausible theory might be that he was trying to play both sides of the fence. Maybe he thought he could, beat government agencies at their own game. But there are tons of circumstantial things that definitely make you stand back and say, what's going on? The day that he first contacted the already existing Underground Press Syndicate, he didn't found the Underground Press Syndicate. He just sort of took it over. The day that he contacted UPS was August 15th, 1967, which happens to be the same day that the CIA's Operation Chaos program began.
Really?
So I would come across things like that, and I would start wondering, is my phone tapped? Like, what? How much should I trust the people I'm talking to? You start to see how easily you can get paranoid around this stuff.
Yeah, once you start questioning, is my phone tapped? It probably is. Probably already is. That's how to stay safe. How many times was this guy arrested? How many arrests did Tom Forçade have in his lifetime?
That I know of, I would say maybe 4.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay.
But these were situations. One of them was possession of LSD in 1969 in Phoenix. That was thrown out. Another was later in 1969 for desecration of an American flag. He wore a flag as a hat band at a press convention. He was bailed out the same day. Those charges were dropped. The biggest one is a 1972 firebombing charge. That was on the last day of the Republican National Convention in 1972. His truck was pulled over. He was arrested for a traffic charge. And then months later, the candles that had been in his vehicle were cited as evidence that he had plotted to blow something up. And that actually got to trial, but was thrown out pretty quickly. I think it was after that arrest that Forçade really stopped trying to be a public figure. I think that shook him up a little bit. At the end of 1972, he went kind of quiet for about a year and a half, and then High Times emerged in 1974.
Yeah, very interesting. By the way, do we know who his attorney was for that case? It was the firebombing?
I cannot remember at the moment, although it is in the book. I think Roger Lowenstein may have been the attorney.
Because it's interesting, because Jerry Lefcourt was so involved with so many of the Yippie, he was Abby Hoffman's attorney for a long time, but with so many Yippie-type cases. And then later on, working for Jeffrey Epstein, he was part of the Jeffrey Epstein defense in Palm Beach down there. It's just, how does that happen, Yeah, Jerry Lefcourt was representing Abby Hoffman when Forçade and Abby Hoffman were fighting about, who owed who what for Steal This Book, and so Jerry Lefcourt remembered Forçade as a very weird, antagonistic individual. Not surprisingly. Oh, so you did interview Lefcourt about the book?
I talked to him, yeah.
Okay, great. I got to get this book, man. I got to get this book. People can check it out. There's a chapter in Rolling Stone. Check that out. But if you want to meet Sean Howe in person, check him out. October 2nd, he's going to be in Los Angeles at the Stories Book and Cafe. And then on October 6th, he's going to be in Phoenix. But then again, October 10th, he's going to be, what is that, upstate New York? Andy's, New York?
Andy's, New York is far upstate in the Catskills, yeah.
And once again, you could find him on Twitter at Sean Howe, Howe, SeanHowe.com. And the book is called Agents of Chaos. Sorry?
Oh, I was just jumping in to say Agents of Chaos.
Yeah, Agents of Chaos, Thomas King Forçade, High Times, and the Paranoid End of the 70s. Why don't you get into that whole story about steal this book? Because the joke is that Abby stole the book. Okay, so why don't you get into the whole story? I have an autographed copy, too, of Abby Hoffman signing an autographed copy of Steal This Book. If anybody wants to make me an offer, I'm open. Okay, but tell us the story about that, about the story about the controversy of Steal This Book.
Yeah, so it's a pretty complicated story, but I'll try to give the overview, which is Abby Hoffman had kind of compiled this book of if you've read Steal This Book, you know
it's a great book,
but it's kind of a resource for people to get free food, get free everything, how to beat the fuzz, I think there's some phone freaking stuff in there, how to get free phone calls. So it's like a source book for how to break the law. It's like a mostly nonviolent anarchist cookbook, I guess. So Forçade was brought on to work as an editor on it, to be the editor of it, and to help use his Underground Press distribution network to get the book in the hands of people. At one point, Abby Hoffman did not want to go through the major publishers. He wanted to try to just go through an alternative distribution system. So Forçade did some editing on the book. He also contributed. He wrote some of the content, and then they had a fallout over money, and Forçade threatened a lawsuit. The people around them kind of huddled and said, why don't we keep this out of the courts and we'll do kind of a people's tribunal. We'll get some people we trust and we'll have a hearing in the basement of this church and we will make a judgment as to who owes who what. So this got play in like the New York Times and the New York Post and the Daily News and all the national news magazines. It was a big deal that like Abby Hoffman was, being sued by another counterculture figure for ripping him off. But the long-lasting effect of this trial, which kind of the outcome was sort of muddled, and I think one of them paid some money and one of them paid. I think the Abbey ended up giving Forçade like free books that he could then sell. It was kind of a draw, but the real outcome of this was that Forçade really began to hate Abby Hoffman, and this is sort of like the seed of the forming the Zippies, and so. The Yippies had famously, said, don't trust anyone over 30, and the Zippies were saying, don't trust the Yippies. So this was kind of all happening, with the backdrop of the McGovern-Nixon campaign, and the Zippies were saying, these guys have endorsed McGovern, they're sellouts, and the Zippies began doing all of these crazy demonstrations and stunts when they were in Miami. They had for instance, a Wheelchairs for Wallace event where they were, pushing a dummy of George Wallace on a wheelchair and then dumping him into the ocean. They stole a portrait of Lyndon Johnson from the convention center and, kind of vandalized that and carried it around. They were really going after as much media attention as they could get and really trying to infuriate as many people as they could.
What about, because the Zippies were like more of aggressive, I guess you might call it, than the old-timer Yippies. Okay, much more street fighters than the Yippies were. Were portrayed as peaceniks, the Yippies, but than the Zippies later on, a little more active. But the thing is that there was just so much smuggling and dealing and distribution going around this whole crowd. So I can kind of see how someone like Forçade could come in with his background and all that kind of power and money and influence and being able to manipulate people in the drug business could come in and take over, which Abbey was doing too as well. They were all dealing. Yeah. Yeah. Now, what...
And Forçade...
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I was just going to say that Forçade really sort of was kind of innovative in that world as well. He started, what he called smokeasies. A friend of his had I guess invented this concept, but these were basically dispensaries, illegal dispensaries of the 1970s. I guess their roots can kind of go back to like tea pads in Harlem, but in the 1970s there really wasn't anything equivalent to this, where you would go into an apartment and they would have like glass jars filled with all of the different kinds of strains of marijuana that you might want, and you could hang out there and sample the wares and then buy in bulk. So Forçade, even before High Times started, and in fact, I think this was part of how he funded High Times, he was kind of perfecting the idea of the New York City dispensary.
Yeah, and they even had dial-a-joint. Mickey Cesar had dial-a-joint, and then a 212-777-CASH that you could call up, and the guys on bicycles would come and deliver the marijuana to you. They can go to his little apartment over there at, I think it was 9.5 Bleecker Street. It was like a little closet where this guy lived. The next door you had 9 Bleecker Street, which was Yippie headquarters. Across the street was Studio 10, the nightclub, which was later renamed the Tom Forçade Multimedia Center. Above that was A.J. Weberman, the head of the Jewish Defense Organization and the Yippies. And John Draper, Captain Crunch, lived up there. He used to crash up there too.
You're right.
The phone freak, yeah. So that was, man, what a time. What a time. What a time. Now you meant we talked. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I talked to John Draper a little bit,
really?
And, he was kind of cagey on something that I had heard, which was that Forçade had asked him to tap the phones at High Times, tap people's offices.
Really?
And he said, well, I didn't really, I might have, what did he call it? Maybe like I might have done a bridge tap or two. But he didn't really want to confirm that for me.
Well, that's pretty good, man, because I remember being at Studio 10 one time when the phone company showed up because we had all these phone lines that no one was paying a bill for. And they wanted to come in and find out what was going on, and we had to kind of like shoo them away. Okay, we didn't have Tom Forçade there with his weapons, but we got rid of them quick enough. But which brings us to another point too, like I guess what would you call it? Like the concert promotion type, like the shakedowns of the concerts, right?
Yeah.
Okay, what do you got there? Describe that.
Sure. So Woodstock was going on just around the time that Forçade was, becoming a well, I was going to say a public face, but he didn't like his face photographed. But around the time that he was meeting all of these counterculture characters, and at the end of the 60s. And, Woodstock, quite famously, Abbie Hoffman tried to get up on the stage and make a speech about, it was actually about John Sinclair. It was about, freeing John Sinclair from prison for his marijuana sentence. And Pete Townsend smashed Abbie Hoffman with his guitar, and Abbie Hoffman left the stage. So that was kind of, a demonstration of, just how little the rock and roll scene wanted politics involved on that level. So what a bunch of people decided to do was, in the rock festivals that followed Woodstock, they wanted to make sure they got a cut of the profits that they could then put into radical causes. So there was a lot of intimidating promoters and saying, like, look, we can reach the underground press, but you need to give us a cut. Or in the case of, there was a Randall's Island New York Pop Festival where they were, even more demanding, and they wanted, bands from, the local bands from the Bronx to play, and they wanted to be able to play Weather Underground communiques on the PA. And so I talk at some length about this Randall's Island fiasco, really. For starters, a lot of the bands were not getting paid, so canceled at the last minute. It was kind of a much uglier version of Woodstock. It wasn't quite Altamont, but it was a lot of people, breaking down fences and starting to riot a little bit. And one thing that would have been very interesting had the bands been playing is there was supposed to be a jam session with like Miles Davis and Jack Bruce and Eric Clapton. Wow. God knows what that would sound like, but it never happened. But there is footage of the Randall's Island Festival, and it looks pretty. It looked like a real downer. So Forçade, I guess that wasn't even enough. He also was involved in something called Winter's End, which was similarly a disaster. They couldn't get the permissions to hold the festival at the last minute, and that happened down in Florida, also in 1970. And there's, they talk about police chasing the promoters around a motel pool, and a biker gang trying to rip off all the profits, and Johnny Winter doing so much acid that he was on stage for like 4 hours.
Yeah, it was a bizarre collective of young lords and the White Panthers. And I think that's where, like, by the way, the Young Lords was Geraldo Rivera. Okay, worked for the Young Lords. And Felipe Luciano and Pablo Guzman. All these guys went on to these huge careers in TV and radio. But that was the coalition that Forçade had put together to shake down these guys.
And there was also the Medicine Ball Caravan, which is
right.
Which was a way that Warner Brothers thought that they could follow up the Woodstock film success. So they staged a cross-country music festival and got, a film crew to capture all of this. And Forçade followed this whole thing around and basically disrupted everything. He got David Peel to play on the roof of his Cadillac. Forçade was driving around this tricked out Cadillac, and David Peel would play songs and heckle the people who were traveling along with this music festival. There have also been hints that maybe Forçade was paid by Warner Brothers.
Oh, really?
To create a spectacle, and Forçade himself was kind of cagey about that. He wrote something that was kind of, it was almost as though he didn't want to totally deny this idea. So once again, his intentions are a little bit hard to discern. But there's also this movie, The Medicine Ball Caravan. You can see footage of Forçade and David Peel, almost getting into a knife fight with one of the organizers. And that is definitely the highlight of that movie.
Yeah, David Peel, another one just recently passed away in the past few years. Another loss that we've had here. What about his girlfriend, Gabrielle Shang? Did she contribute, or is she still alive?
Yep. She's still around. She was his girlfriend, and they were married in '77. So she's actually his widow.
Oh, really?
And she had come from a very kind of sheltered background, but then sort of threw herself into radical politics. And she was kind of a little more aligned with the yippie crowd in Miami. And it was after this 1972 Zippy Yippie fight. She later reconnected with Forçade after she'd been working at the Berkeley Barb, and she'd been like handling SLA communiques in Berkeley, and he really courted her very aggressively, and they got together. She moved to New York, and she was involved in the Underground Press Syndicate. It changed its name to the Alternative Press Syndicate, and so she was heavily involved in that. And I think there was always a little bit of a sort of a standoff vibe between her and some of the Zippies who thought that she was more part of the Abby and Jerry group. So
well, I think for a while she was. I think for a while she was in Miami, right?
In Miami, she was. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, and then she became. She was covering the Patty Hearst kidnapping, and she was receiving cassette tapes, right? And was like a transit for the communications.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And you think people would be more interested in this kind of stuff, like the High Times guy, and his girlfriend, his wife. I didn't know that was his wife.
Yeah.
Was involved in all this stuff. No one knows. Geraldo Rivera involved in Shaking Down. No one knows.
There's a great little anecdote that I got from someone who was like a 14-year-old. He was kind of like a Cameron Crowe type. He was a 14-year-old reporter, and he was trying to do a high school project, and he was calling all these places trying to get an assignment. And Gabrielle gave him an assignment to write about the Zippies for the Alternative Press Syndicate's magazine. And so he tells me this story of going over to 9 Bleecker and these guys kind of like looking out through a slot in the door.
Yeah, that's probably me. That was my job.
And they were like, he said they were really paranoid about this like 14-year-old kid who wanted to talk to them. But he actually had a nice time talking to them and wrote a story for it. And anyway, this guy turned out, his name's R.J. Cutler, and he grew up to be an Oscar-winning documentarian. He made that movie, The War Room, about Bill Clinton.
Wow.
He's had a very illustrious career, but this was sort of like his entree into journalism was going over to 9 Bleecker and meeting, Darren Kay and Mike Chance and those guys.
And now, what year was that?
That was in '76.
Yeah, I would have been there. Yeah. Now, and also, it's the funniest thing is you talk about this door at 9 Bleecker. Okay, it was a big, giant, thick wooden plywood door, like you said, with a big peephole in it. And when you had to leave, there was no lock on the outside. You had to lock it from the inside. So someone always had to be locked inside to guard whatever's going on upstairs that we couldn't talk about. Okay. We're running out of time, though. We're running out of time. I want to hear about the death. There's a lot of conspiracy and allegations and suspicion about what I believe was a suicide. But what did you conclude?
I think so too. I mean, there are a number of theories, and I did speak to people who knew Tom well, people from High Times, people from the political arena, who just said, I will never believe it's a suicide. Like, until the day I die, I will never believe that he committed suicide. But I tend to think that that is what happened. He had there was a very deep history of depression and bipolar disorder in his family. I get into that. I go back to the 19th century, talking about some of his family history, and I think his depression was pretty well documented, by a lot of people who knew him. It got a lot worse in '78. His best friend died in a plane crash, in a smuggling operation that Forçade was a part of. He was also stressed about, Larry Flynt had been shot. Larry Flynt was the distributor of High Times at that moment, and Forçade was worried that people were coming for him, and he was not, not only was he not being treated properly for his bipolar disorder, but he was taking a lot of Quaaludes, I think, and he had gone out to Hollywood to try to get Robert Evans involved in making a movie, and that had gone poorly. Evans was only interested in Forçade's cocaine connection.
Yeah.
So there were a number of things that were really, Forçade was spiraling about. And so, as much as someone might, have a theory that, an assassin came through an unlocked window, I tend to think that he shot himself.
Yeah, and Gabriel Chang was there. No, but Robert Evans, I didn't realize he had a connection to Robert Evans, who also has a connection to Larry Flynt. Is all that in your book about
the connection?
Is Evans in your book?
Just a little bit in that story where, Forçade has a meeting with him at Evans' home, and kind of Forçade sits down and places a vial of cocaine on the center of the coffee table, but doesn't offer it. He just sort of lets Evans look at it and salivate over it. A lot of, he played a lot of games. He was really into head trips. So he was always making things a little more maybe uncomfortable than they had to be.
Yeah, which was like a pattern among that whole bunch. Abby Hoffman too had the same depression, seasonal depression, and the same kind of presence. And Dana we discussed too. But now I think I had mentioned Larry Flynt and Hustler, and you had something to say.
Oh, I was going to. I think you were saying there were connections between Robert Evans and Larry Flynt, and I was going to say there were so many. Definitely was the kind of book where like you need like index cards and string, and to have your like board of like what's connected to what. There's also some connections between Larry Flynt. There are. I don't know if you've ever heard of like Mitch Werbel, the arms dealer.
Oh yeah. We've covered all that here. We've covered all that here.
He was connected to a guy named Ken Bernstein, who Forçade was in business with in smuggling. Oh, really? So there are just, I had to draw the line with like, I could only get so much into like the Bay of Pigs connections in this book, but like it all like I was dizzy from how many things fed into other things, and I tried to lay it out as simply as possible, because that's a whole world that you can get really tied up in.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Larry Flynt's bodyguard, Bill Menser, actually did a murder involving Robert Evans. Yeah, and Bill Menser listens to the show, by the way. Okay, he's a fan of the show. We did a show about him, and he loves us. Okay, what else haven't I asked you, man? We got about 3 minutes left. What else haven't I asked you really want the audience to know about? I got to get this book. Yeah, I recommend everybody get this book. There's a lot in here that I think is relevant to, things that are going on in the world today about media objectivity. There's a lot about First Amendment press rights. Actually, Forçade had a case for press credentials that was used as precedent in CNN's case against Donald Trump's administration when Jim Acosta couldn't get press rights. They used Tom Forçade's case to win that. There's a lot about the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, and there's a lot about just like
people fighting, people of similar political persuasions who are not trusting each other, accusing each other, and not really working together. That I think in 2023 is really is hugely relevant.
Yeah, such a different world. Such a different world. Sean Howe, you could find Sean Howe on his website, SeanHowe.com. That's spelled Howe. By the way, he's on Blue Sky, too. He's got like 1,000 followers on Blue Sky. I don't know how he pulled that off. But you can find him on Sean Howe and Blue Sky. I got like 5. I got like 5 followers on Blue Sky.
I got in early.
Yeah, I'm sure you did, man. Twitter, you could find him on Twitter, Sean Howe on Twitter. And this book we've been talking about, okay, it's called Agents of Chaos. Thomas King Forçade, High Times and the Paranoid Ends of the 70s. I'm sure we haven't covered everything, but if you just want to check out the first chapter, it's in the Rolling Stone. Very well written, man. Covers there's a lot of meat in there right there. He's written another book called The Untold Story about Marvel Comics. So check that out too as well. You want to meet him in person? Hey, meet him in person. Bring a pie. Throw a pie at Sean Howe in memory of Tom Forçade, who invented the pie throwing, by the way, before Aaron Kay. October 2nd, Los Angeles, 7 p.m. Stories Book and Cafe. And then also to October 6th in Phoenix at the Changing Hands Bookstore. October 10th, this guy's flying all over the place. Diamond Hollow Books in Andes, New York. Sean Howe, thank you so much.
Thank you. So great to talk to you.
Great stuff, man. Great stuff. I'm really looking forward to reading this book. SeanHowe.com. Good night, my friend.